What if I told you America's wealthiest families once engineered a secret industry one more profitable than cotton and more monstrous than fiction? In the suffocating quiet of a forgotten archive, where sunlight filtered through stained glass and dust motes danced in the stagnant air, a single object waited to be found. It was a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked and brittle, sealed with a wax emblem that had not been broken in over a century. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls remembered the secrets pressed between those yellowed pages. Imagine for a moment the trembling hands of the archivist as they sliced through the wax, the faint scent of old tallow mingling with the musty perfume of decaying paper. The ledger's spine creaked open, and the first page revealed a name written in a hand so precise it bordered on obsession. Beneath it, columns of numbers, names, and notations, births, deaths, measurements, and something else. Something colder. Genetic improvements, the author had written, as if cataloging livestock, not human lives. What if I told you that the most respected families in America's South names, etched into marble, celebrated in history books, engineered a secret industry more profitable than cotton and more monstrous than fiction? What if the true engine of their wealth was not the fields, but the bodies and bloodlines of the people they owned? This ledger, sealed and hidden for generations, is not just a record. It is a confession. A map of a conspiracy so vast, so meticulously orchestrated, that it operated in the shadows for decades, unseen by the world above. As the pages turn, the ink seems to bleed with the weight of what was done. Here are the heights and weights of children, the pairings of men and women, the cold calculations of profit margins that soared as human beings were bred, evaluated, and sold. Here are the letters carefully folded, pressed between the pages where plantation owners discussed their successes in language borrowed from science, but twisted into something unrecognizable. Tonight, we will follow the trail left by this ledger. We will descend into the hidden chambers of Charleston's elite, where the line between progress and horror was erased in the name of profit. What you are about to hear will change how you see American history, and perhaps how you see the world itself. Are you ready to break the seal? Charleston in the 1840s was a city of contradictions, a place where beauty and brutality coexisted in uneasy silence. By day, the city dazzled with its grand avenues lined by live oaks, their branches draped in Spanish moss, like the tattered finery of a bygone age. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and salt, the distant clang of ship bells mingling with the laughter of children playing in sunlit courtyards. Carriages rattled over cobblestone streets, their polished wheels carrying the city's elite to and from their stately homes mansions painted in pastel hues, their piazzas shaded by fluttering linen curtains. To the casual visitor, Charleston was the very image of Southern gentility. The city's social calendar was a tapestry of garden parties, charity balls, and church picnics, each event more elaborate than the last. Ladies in silk gowns and gentlemen in tailored coats exchanged pleasantries beneath the gaslit chandeliers of drawing rooms, their conversations a delicate dance of wit and decorum. The names that echoed through these halls, Ravenel, Rutledge, Pinckney, Drayton, were spoken with reverence, as if their bearers were not merely citizens, but the living embodiment of Charleston's proud heritage. Yet beneath this polished veneer, shadows gathered. The city's wealth, so ostentatiously displayed, was built on the backs of the enslaved. Along the waterfront, the cries of the auction block were muffled by the clatter of commerce, and the rice plantations that ringed the city like a green crown were worked by hands that would never know freedom. The same families who presided over Charleston's social life also presided over its suffering, their fortunes measured not only in acres and silver, but in the number of souls they owned. It was in the private sanctuaries of these families that the obsession with improvement took root. The men of Charleston's elite prided themselves on their scientific curiosity, their willingness to embrace the latest advances in agriculture and animal husbandry. At the Charleston Agricultural Society, they debated crop rotation and soil chemistry with the fervor of philosophers. They bred horses and cattle with meticulous care, boasting of bloodlines and pedigrees as if reciting scripture. But the language of improvement was a mask, a polite fiction that concealed a darker ambition. In the hushed corners of drawing rooms and behind the closed doors of private studies, these men spoke of labor optimization and genetic potential. They exchanged letters filled with coded references to pairings and stock, their words stripped of humanity, their meaning clear only to those initiated into the secret. The same scientific principles that had transformed their fields and stables were now being applied to the people they enslaved. Charleston's social rituals became the stage upon which these secrets played out. At the annual Harvest Ball, the city's most powerful families gathered beneath the flickering light of crystal chandeliers, their laughter echoing through the marble halls. But behind the smiles and toasts, alliances were forged and bargains struck. A whispered conversation in the garden, a knowing glance across the ballroom. These were the signals by which the network communicated, their true business conducted in shadows. For the women of these families, the rituals of society were both shield and shackle. They presided over tea tables and charity committees, their days filled with the management of households and the cultivation of appearances. Yet even they were not immune to the city's darkness. Some suspected, others knew, but all were bound by the unspoken rule. What happened behind closed doors was never to be spoken of in public. As the sun set over the Ashley and Cooper rivers, casting long shadows across the city's grand facades, Charleston transformed. The gaslights flickered to life, illuminating the streets with a soft, golden glow. But in the alleys and back rooms, in the fields beyond the city's edge, the true engine of Charleston's prosperity continued its relentless work. The city's beauty was a mask, its gentility a performance. Beneath it all, something monstrous stirred hidden in plain sight. Thomas Whitfield arrived in Charleston would be brought with the air of a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. He was the only son of a newly wealthy planter, a family whose fortune had been made not in the old rice fields of the low country, but in the restless, speculative markets of the north. His father, eager to secure a place among the city's storied elite, had purchased Millbrook Estate, a modest but promising plantation some 20 miles north of Charleston. It was a calculated move, a bid for legitimacy in a world where lineage mattered more than ledger books. But Thomas was not like the other heirs who haunted Charleston's drawing rooms. He had spent his formative years far from the humid heat of the South, studying agriculture at Harvard, where the air was crisp and the ideas even sharper. In Cambridge, he had walked among abolitionists and philosophers, men and women who spoke of liberty and human dignity as if these were not just ideals, but birthrights. He had listened, argued, and though he would never admit it, allowed men changed. Returning to South Carolina, Thomas found himself a stranger in his own land. The city's rituals felt both familiar and alien, their elegance tinged with something he could not name. He moved through the social season with practiced ease, attending garden parties and suppers, his manners impeccable, his accent just southern enough to pass. Yet beneath the surface, he was always watching, always measuring the distance between what was said and what was meant. His father, proud of his son's education, urged him to make connections, to learn from the old families who ruled Charleston society. "Observe, Thomas," he would say, "and you'll see how things are truly done here." And so Thomas observed. He watched the way the city's elite spoke of progress and tradition in the same breath, how they praised innovation in their fields, while clinging to the ancient hierarchies that kept them in power. He saw the easy camaraderie of men who had known each other since childhood, their laughter masking the calculations behind every handshake. But it was in the quiet moments, alone in his room at Millbrook, that Thomas's unease grew. He could not shake the memory of his professors' voices, the arguments about the moral cost of slavery, the stories of families torn apart and lives reduced to numbers on a page. Here, in Charleston, those numbers were everywhere on ledgers, in conversations, in the very air he breathed. The city's beauty seemed to him a kind of camouflage, a way of hiding the truth in plain sight. He tried to reconcile the world he had left with the one he had returned to. He told himself that he was only an observer, that his role was to learn, not to judge. But the more he saw, the harder it became to maintain that distance. At dinners, he listened as men discussed improving the stock with the same detachment they used for cattle. At the Agricultural Society, he heard talk of efficiency and optimization, words that sounded progressive but felt like a mask for something colder. Thomas's outsider status gave him a vantage point denied to those born into Charleston's inner circles. He noticed the silences that fell when certain topics arose, the coded language that passed between the city's patriarchs. He saw the way the enslaved were spoken of never as people, always as assets, resources, problems to be managed. And he saw, too, the fear that flickered in the eyes of those who served, a fear so deep it had become invisible to those who caused it. As the weeks passed, Thomas's unease hardened into suspicion. He began to keep a journal, recording the conversations and observations that troubled him. He wrote in a cipher of his own invention, a habit born of both caution and necessity. The more he wrote, the more he realized that something was deeply wrong, not just with the system, but with the men who perpetuated it. There was a secret here, something darker than even the abolitionists in Boston had imagined. He did not yet know the shape of the horror that waited in Charleston's shadows, but he could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of every conversation, every polite smile. And as the city's social season reached its fevered pitch, Thomas Whitfield, heir, outsider, reluctant observer, found himself drawn inexorably toward Thomas Whitfield arrived in Charleston, would change him with the air of Charleston forever, everywhere and nowhere at once. He was the only son of a newly wealthy planter, a family whose fortune had been made not in the old rice fields of the low country, but in the restless, speculative markets of the North. His father, eager to secure a place among the city's storied elite, had purchased Millbrook Estate, a modest but promising plantation some 20 miles north of Charleston. It was a calculated move, a bid for legitimacy in a world where lineage mattered more than ledger books. But Thomas was not like the other heirs who haunted Charleston's drawing rooms. He had spent his formative years far from the humid heat of the South, studying agriculture at Harvard, where the air was crisp and the ideas even sharper. In Cambridge, he had walked among abolitionists and philosophers, men and women who spoke of liberty and human dignity as if these were not just ideals, but birthrights. He had listened, argued, and though he would never admit it, allowed been changed. Returning to South Carolina, Thomas found himself a stranger in his own land. The city's rituals felt both familiar and alien, their elegance tinged with something he could not name. He moved through the social season with practiced ease, attending garden parties and suppers, his manners impeccable, his accent just southern enough to pass. Yet beneath the surface, he was always watching, always measuring the distance between what was said and what was meant. His father, proud of his son's education, urged him to make connections, to learn from the old families who ruled Charleston society. "Observe, Thomas," he would say, "and you'll see how things are truly done here." And so Thomas observed. He watched the way the city's elite spoke of progress and tradition in the same breath, how they praised innovation in their fields, while clinging to the ancient hierarchies that kept them in power. He saw the easy camaraderie of men who had known each other since childhood, their laughter masking the calculations behind every handshake. But it was in the quiet moments, alone in his room at Millbrook, that Thomas's unease grew. He could not shake the memory of his professors' voices, the arguments about the moral cost of slavery, the stories of families torn apart and lives reduced to numbers on a page. Here, in Charleston, Those numbers were everywhere on ledgers, in conversations, in the very air he breathed. The city's beauty seemed to him a kind of camouflage, a way of hiding the truth in plain sight. He tried to reconcile the world he had left with the one he had returned to. He told himself that he was only an observer, that his role was to learn, not to judge. But the more he saw, the harder it became to maintain that distance. At dinners, he listened as men discussed improving the stock with the same detachment they used for cattle. At the agricultural society, he heard talk of efficiency and optimization, words that sounded progressive but felt like a mask for something colder. Thomas's outsider status gave him a vantage point denied to those born into Charleston's inner circles. He noticed the silences that fell when certain topics arose, the coded language that passed between the city's patriarchs. He saw the way the enslaved were spoken of never as people, always as assets, resources, problems to be managed. And he saw, too, the fear that flickered in the eyes of those who served, a fear so deep it had become invisible to those who caused it. As the weeks passed, Thomas's unease hardened into suspicion. He began to keep a journal, recording the conversations and observations that troubled him. He wrote in a cipher of his own invention, a habit born of both caution and necessity. The more he wrote, the more he realized that something was deeply wrong, not just with the system, but with the men who perpetuated it. There was a secret here, something darker than even the abolitionists in Boston had imagined. He did not yet know the shape of the horror that waited in Charleston's shadows, but he could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of every conversation, every polite smile. And as the city's social season reached its fevered pitch, Thomas Whitfield, heir, outsider, reluctant observer, found himself drawn inexorably toward the heart of a mystery. The December air in Charleston was sharp forever, and restless, a rare chill settling over the city, as if the world itself sensed something unnatural stirring. On this night, the Drayton estate glowed with the warmth of 100 lamps, its windows casting golden rectangles onto the frost-laced gardens. Inside, the annual harvest celebration was in full swing, music and laughter spilling from the ballroom, the scent of roasted meats and mulled wine drifting through the halls. But Thomas Whitfield moved through the festivities like a man in a dream, his mind fixed on the fragments of conversation he had gathered over the past weeks. He had come prepared, a small leather journal tucked inside his coat, its pages already filled with coded notes. He watched the older men, Dr. Ravenel, Colonel Drayton, Colonel Rutledge gathering in the study after dinner, their faces grave, their voices low. When the time came, Thomas excused himself from the company of Margaret Pinckney, murmuring something about fresh air and a headache. He slipped out into the garden, the cold biting through his coat, and circled quietly to the side of the house where the study's windows overlooked a deserted path. The glass was fogged with warmth from within, but a narrow gap at the sash let the voices drift out, clear and unguarded. Thomas pressed himself against the brick, heart pounding, and listened. Dr. Ravenel's voice was the first he recognized, calm and authoritative. "Gentlemen, the results from our 3-year initiative have exceeded all projections. Millfield Plantation alone has produced 17 births from our selected pairings, with an average height increase of 2 inches over the previous generation. More importantly, the children show enhanced physical capacity and resistance to common ailments." Papers rustled. Colonel Rutledge spoke next, his tone brisk. "The Pinckney operation has been equally successful. Their focus on selecting for docility while maintaining physical strength has produced remarkable results. The new generation shows 25% less resistance to instruction while maintaining superior work capacity." Thomas's breath caught. The words were delivered with the detachment of men discussing livestock, not human beings. He felt a wave of nausea, but forced himself to remain still, to listen. Colonel Drayton's voice was deeper, edged with pride. What we have accomplished here extends far beyond individual plantation success. Our network now includes operations in Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. The breeding records we maintain allow us to track bloodlines across state boundaries, ensuring optimal genetic combinations that would have been impossible working in isolation. A chair scraped against the floor. Dr. Ravenel continued. Each birth must be recorded with precise measurements, parentage information, and projected value assessments. Our records now contain detailed information on over 800 individuals across the network. This data allows us to plan breeding combinations 5 years in advance. Thomas's hand shook as he scribbled in his journal, the words blurring before his eyes. The scale of it was staggering. A coordinated, multi-state enterprise, treating human lives as raw material for profit and experimentation. The conversation grew darker. They spoke of breeding houses where young women were kept solely for reproduction, of stud selections where men were chosen for their physical attributes, of children evaluated and sorted like crops. Those who did not meet the standards were redirected to standard agricultural operations, a phrase Thomas understood to mean separation, hardship, and likely death. He could hear the pride in their voices, the satisfaction of men who believed themselves pioneers. Dr. Ravenel described documentation, protocols, insisting on the importance of accuracy and secrecy. Our success depends on discretion. The records must be kept secure, and only those with direct involvement should have access. Colonel Drayton added, "We have partners in Mississippi and Arkansas eager to adopt our methods." The financial projections are extraordinary profits, 3 times higher than traditional cotton cultivation. Gentlemen, we are on the verge of transforming Southern agriculture. The men toasted, their glasses clinking in the lamplight. Thomas felt the cold seep into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. He realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he was witnessing not the isolated cruelty of a few men, but the birth of an industry, a systematic, scientific approach to human breeding, sanctioned and celebrated by the most powerful families in the South. He pressed his forehead to the cold glass, fighting the urge to flee. The horror was not just in the words, but in the ease with which they were spoken. These men saw themselves as innovators, their cruelty justified by the promise of progress and profit. The ledger he had glimpsed, the coded conversations, the careful secrecy, all of it, pointed to a conspiracy so vast and so deeply rooted that it seemed unassailable. Yet in that moment, something shifted within Thomas. The fear that had kept him silent was replaced by a grim resolve. He could not unhear what he had heard, could not unsee the machinery of suffering that turned beneath Charleston's polished surface. He would find a way to expose the truth, no matter the cost. As the meeting ended and the men drifted back to the warmth of the ballroom, Thomas remained in the shadows, his breath clouding in the night air. He knew that the path ahead would be dangerous, that the men he had just overheard would stop at nothing to protect their secret. But he also knew that he could not turn away. What Thomas had witnessed that night was only the beginning. The true depths of the breeding network's horror and the lengths to which its architects would go to preserve it remained hidden in the darkness. And as he slipped back into the garden, the ledger pressed to his chest, Thomas Whitfield made a silent vow. He would bring the truth into the light, even if it destroyed him. The plantation, by daylight, was a vision of Southern prosperity. Its avenues were lined with ancient oaks, their roots tangled deep in the red earth, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. The main house, painted a pale blue that caught the morning sun, stood at the heart of manicured gardens and orderly fields. To the untrained eye, it was a place of order and gentility, a testament to the Pinckney family's wealth and taste. But Thomas Whitfield had learned to look beyond the surface. He had spent weeks cultivating his relationship with Margaret Pinckney, her laughter and intelligence, a welcome distraction from the darkness he sensed at the edges of her world. Their courtship, at first a calculated ruse, had grown into something more complicated, a tangle of affection and guilt that left Thomas restless and uncertain. Yet it was this closeness that granted him access to the inner workings of the estate and to the secrets that lay hidden beyond the gardens. It was a humid evening in late spring when Thomas found his opportunity. Margaret, suffering from a headache, had retired early, and her father was away on business in Georgia. The main house was quiet, the staff preoccupied with their own routines. Thomas excused himself after dinner, claiming a desire to walk the grounds and clear his mind. Instead, he slipped away from the lantern-lit paths and made his way toward the far edge of the property, where a cluster of low, whitewashed buildings stood apart from the rest. These were the breeding quarters. At first glance, the quarters seemed almost comfortable, certainly more so than the cramped, crumbling cabins that housed most of the plantation's enslaved. The buildings were arranged in a neat square around a central courtyard, their windows large and their porches shaded by awnings. Flowering vines climbed the walls, and the air was heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth. It was, Thomas realized, a calculated illusion. The comfort was not kindness, but strategy. Healthy, well-fed women were more likely to bear healthy children, and the Pinckneys spared no expense in maintaining the appearance of care. He moved quietly, keeping to the shadows, his heart pounding with each step. Through a partially open window, he glimpsed the main dormitory. Inside, rows of beds were arranged with military precision, each one occupied by a young woman. Their ages varied, some barely more than girls, others in the full bloom of womanhood, but all shared the same haunted stillness. They lay in silence, eyes open and unblinking, their faces turned toward the ceiling, as if waiting for something they could not name. There was no conversation, no laughter, not even the soft murmur of comfort between friends. Only the sound of quiet breathing, the occasional rustle of linen. Later, Thomas would learn that the women were given mild sedatives each evening, a precaution to ensure compliance and prevent the formation of bonds that might lead to resistance or escape. Their world was one of enforced solitude, their bodies managed with the same clinical detachment as the livestock in the stables. He slipped around the side of the building, careful to avoid the lanterns that marked the overseer's patrol. The second structure was a medical facility, its interior lit by the cold glow of oil lamps. Through a crack in the door, Thomas saw examination tables lined with white cloth, scales and measuring devices arranged on polished shelves. Charts hung on the walls, each one meticulously updated with notes on menstrual cycles, nutritional intake, and pregnancy schedules. The handwriting was precise, the language chillingly impersonal. Subject 14 conception successful, due October. Subject 22 repeat pairing recommended. A young woman sat on the edge of one table, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. A white-coated physician moved around her, taking measurements, recording data, never once speaking to her as a person. The woman did not flinch, did not protest. She simply endured, her silence a shield against the indignity of her situation. Thomas felt a surge of helpless rage. He wanted to burst into the room, to shout, to demand that someone see these women for who they were. But he knew that to do so would be to doom them and himself. Instead, he watched, memorizing every detail, every procedure, every name he could glimpse on the charts. The third building was the Nursery and Evaluation Center. Here, the true purpose of the breeding program was laid bare. Rows of cribs lined the walls, each one occupied by a swaddled infant. Nurses moved between them, checking charts, administering formula, recording weights and lengths. On one wall, a large board displayed the names and numbers of the children, each assigned a category: premium stock, standard labor, reassignment pending. Thomas's breath caught as he watched a nurse lift a baby from its crib, examining the child's limbs, eyes, and mouth with the practiced detachment of someone inspecting merchandise. The child whimpered, reaching for the nurse, but was set aside with a gentle firmness that brooked no argument. Another nurse entered, carrying a clipboard. "This one's strong," she said, her voice low. "Good temperament. Mark for special training." The efficiency of the operation was staggering. Every aspect of the women's lives, their diets, their sleep, their interactions, was controlled and recorded. The children were evaluated from birth, their futures determined by a set of criteria that reduced their humanity to a series of numbers and traits. Those deemed valuable were raised in the nursery, given extra care and attention. Those who did not meet the standards were sent away, their fates unspoken but understood. Yet even in this place of control and calculation, Thomas saw flashes of resistance. A woman brushing a tear from her cheek when she thought no one was watching. A nurse lingering a moment too long at a crib, her hand resting gently on a baby's head. The smallest gestures of care, of defiance, of memory. He slipped away before dawn. The images burned into his mind. The comfort of the breeding quarters was a lie a velvet glove over an iron fist. The women's silence was not consent, but survival. Their humanity, denied by those who claimed to own them, endured in the quiet spaces between orders and obedience. As Thomas made his way back to the main house, the first light of morning breaking over the fields, he knew that what he had witnessed was only a fragment of the truth. The real horror was not just in the suffering, but in the system that made such suffering possible, and in the ease with which it was hidden. The Pinckney main house was silent in the hours before dawn, the hush broken only by the distant call of a night bird and the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Thomas moved with purpose, his footsteps muffled by thick carpets, his heart thundering in his chest. He had spent weeks mapping the rhythms of the household, learning when the overseer made his rounds, when the servants retired, when the house itself seemed to exhale and let down its guard. Tonight, with Margaret and her father both absent, the opportunity was too perfect to ignore. He slipped into the study, a room lined with dark mahogany shelves and the scent of old tobacco. The safe was hidden behind a false panel, just as William Pinckney had drunkenly boasted one night over cards. Thomas's hands trembled as he worked the combination, the numbers etched into his memory by necessity and fear. The lock gave way with a soft click, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a leather strap, was the master registry. He set the heavy ledger on the desk, its cover embossed with the Pinckney family crest. The leather was worn smooth by generations of hands, the pages thick and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. Thomas opened it, and the secrets of the network spilled out before him. The first pages were meticulous index names, dates, locations, cross-referenced with a system of codes. He ran his finger down the columns. Drayton E. Charleston, 1841 Initiative A. Rutledge, J. Savannah, 1842 Initiative B. Each country was a doorway into another life, another story, another act of calculated cruelty. He turned the page, and the ledger's true nature revealed itself. Here were diagrams, family trees, drawn with geometric precision, lines connecting mothers to children, fathers to offspring, each branch annotated with measurements and notes. Subject 17, height 5 feet 10, robust build, compliant temperament. Paired with subject 22, high fertility, strong constitution. Offspring 3, all above average in physical development. Thomas's eyes moved over the charts, the language clinical and cold. Pairing 14 to 7, unsuccessful. Recommend reassignment of female to alternate stud. Note, resistance observed, corrective measures applied. The words blurred, the meaning unmistakable. Every life reduced to data points, every child a product, every woman a vessel. He found correspondence tucked between the pages, letters folded and sealed. their contents as damning as the records themselves. One, written in a careful, slanted hand, read, "Dear Dr. Ravenel, the Georgia operation reports a 30% increase in viable births following the adoption of your nutritional protocols. We are eager to exchange breeding stock for the upcoming season. Please advise on the selection of docile males for our new facility. Yours in progress, J. Benning." Another, more chilling in its ambition. To the members of the consortium, our recent experiments in North Carolina have yielded promising results. By introducing controlled education for select offspring, we have observed increased compliance and skill acquisition. The potential for specialized labor is significant. Enclosed are the latest financial projections. Profits now exceed traditional cotton yields by a factor of 3. Let us continue to refine our methods. In confidence, A. Drayton. Thomas's hands shook as he read, the scale of the operation dawning on him. This was not the work of a single plantation, or even a handful of families. It was a network sprawling, coordinated, scientific in its ambition, and ruthless in its execution. The registry documented over 1,400 individuals, their lives mapped and measured, their futures decided by men who saw themselves as architects of a new order. He flipped to a section marked Expansion. Here, the language grew even more audacious. Mississippi, land acquired for new breeding facility. Projected output, 60 viable offspring per annum. Texas, negotiations underway with local authorities to ensure discretion. Arkansas, initial stock to be transferred by year's end. All correspondence to be routed through secure channels. There were diagrams of buildings, blueprints for dormitories, nurseries, medical wards. Notes on ventilation, sanitation, dietary regimens. Margins filled with calculations. Optimal pairing intervals, 14 months. Projected increase in market value, 18% per generation. The efficiency was chilling. The attention to detail a testament to the network's obsession with control. But it was the final pages that struck Thomas hardest. Here, in a section labeled Failures, were the names of women and children who had not met the network's standards. Subject 41, stillbirth. Subject 56, chronic illness, reassigned to field labor. Subject 73, behavioral issues removed from breeding program. Each entry was a sentence, a life dismissed with a stroke of the pen. He closed his eyes, the weight of what he had uncovered pressing down on him. The ledger was more than evidence. It was a monument to suffering, a record of lives stolen and shaped by the cold logic of profit and power. If you're still watching, comment, "I'm still here," because most people can't handle what comes next. This is the point where many turn away, where the horror becomes too much to bear. But the truth demands witnesses. The truth demands that we look, even when every instinct tells us to look away. Thomas knew, as he carefully copied the most damning pages, that he was holding the key to the network's destruction. But he also knew that the men who had built the system would do anything to protect it. The registry was their blueprint, their confession, their Achilles heel. He wrapped the ledger in its oilcloth once more, his hands steady now with purpose. The dawn was breaking over the Pinckney estate, the first light creeping across the fields. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. Thomas slipped from the study, the weight of the ledger heavy in his arms, the knowledge of what he had seen burning in his mind. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering, the ambition monstrous. And as Thomas disappeared into the morning shadows, he understood that exposing the truth would be more dangerous and more necessary than anything he had ever imagined. The days after Thomas's infiltration of the Pinckney estate passed in a haze of dread. He moved through Charleston streets and parlors with the same careful composure as always. But now every glance felt weighted, every conversation edged with suspicion. The city's beauty had curdled into menace. He could feel the network's eyes on him, watching, calculating dot It began with small things. A servant who once greeted him with a nod now averted his gaze. A letter from Margaret arrived, her words clipped and formal, as if she were writing to a stranger. At the Charleston club, William Pinckney's laughter was brittle, his gaze darting to the door whenever Thomas entered. The air was thick with secrets, and Thomas knew he was no longer invisible. The confrontation came one morning at Millbrook Estate. Thomas was at breakfast, the silverware gleaming in the pale light, when the butler announced visitors. Colonel Drayton entered first, his posture ramrod straight, his eyes cold and appraising. Behind him came Dr. Samuel Huger, a man whose reputation for plantation security was whispered about in fearful tones, and a third figure, Mr. Crawford, whose scarred hands and silent presence radiated quiet threat. "Thomas, my boy," Drayton began, his voice smooth as silk, "we've become concerned about certain irregularities in our operations. It seems someone has taken an unusual interest in our private business methods." Thomas forced a smile, his mind racing. "I'm not sure I understand, Colonel. Is there something I can help clarify?" Dr. Huger leaned forward, his gaze clinical, dissecting. "We have reason to believe that someone with access to our social gatherings has been documenting private conversations, possibly even accessing confidential records. Such activities, you understand, are not merely breaches of etiquette. They threaten the very foundation of our enterprise." Crawford said nothing, but his eyes never left Thomas's face. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Thomas chose his words with care. "Gentlemen, I assure you, my only interest is in learning from those more experienced than myself. My father always said that observation is the key to success." Drayton's smile did not reach his eyes. "Observation is valuable, yes. But there are lines, Thomas. Lines that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed." Huger's voice was softer now, almost gentle. "You're an educated man, Mr. Whitfield. You understand the importance of discretion. The methods we employ are revolutionary, but not everyone would appreciate their significance. There are those who would twist our innovations into something ugly." Thomas felt the walls closing in. The threat was not just of violence, but of erasure, social annihilation. In Charleston, to be cast out was to become a ghost, stripped of name, fortune, and future. The network's power was not only in its wealth, but in its ability to make inconvenient people disappear first from society, then from memory. Crawford finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "We know you accessed the Pinckney estate's private records 2 nights ago. We have a witness. You now possess information that could destroy legitimate business, operations, and ruin respectable families." Thomas's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "If you believe I've done something wrong, I'm sure we can resolve it. I have no desire to cause trouble." Drayton's tone hardened. "We are offering you a choice, Thomas. Join us, contribute your knowledge, your property, your loyalty, or face the consequences. And let me be clear, the consequences are not limited to yourself. Reputations, families, futures, all are at stake." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with unspoken threat. Thomas realized that his every move had been watched, his every word weighed. The network was a living thing, and he was now inside its jaws. He looked from Drayton to Huger to Crawford, searching for any sign of mercy. There was none. Only the cold certainty of men who believed themselves untouchable. For a moment, Thomas considered surrender, accepting their offer, becoming one more cog in the machine. But the memory of the breeding quarters, the ledger, the silent suffering of the women and children burned in his mind. He could not turn back. He nodded slowly, masking his fear with a show of reluctant acceptance. "I understand. May I have some time to consider your proposal?" Drayton's smile returned, thin and sharp. "Of course, but not too long, Thomas. The network is patient, but not infinitely so. As the men departed, leaving behind an atmosphere of suffocating menace, Thomas sat alone at the breakfast table, the weight of their ultimatum pressing down on him. He knew now that survival would require more than courage. It would require cunning and a willingness to risk everything not just for himself, but for the truth. The web had tightened. The next move would be his last chance. And somewhere, in the shadows of Charleston, the network Thomas Whitfield became a man divided. Outwardly, he played the part the network demanded, the eager young heir, humbled by the invitation to join Charleston's most exclusive circle, grateful for the trust of men whose names shaped the city's destiny. He attended their meetings, nodded at their plans, and even offered suggestions, always careful to appear ambitious, but never threatening. The network, satisfied by his apparent submission, welcomed him with open arms. They mistook his silence for loyalty, his careful questions for admiration. But beneath the surface, Thomas's every nerve was stretched taut. Each day was a performance, every word a calculation. He moved through the city with a smile fixed to his face, all the while haunted by the memory of the breeding quarters, the ledger's damning pages, the cold arithmetic of suffering. The network's confidence was absolute. They spoke freely in his presence, certain that their power was unassailable, their secrets safe behind a wall of wealth and influence. At the next gathering, Thomas was presented to the full consortium. The meeting took place in a private room above Henderson's Tavern, a space chosen for its discretion, and multiple exits. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive brandy. Drayton, Huger, and Crawford presided, flanked by the city's most powerful men. They toasted Thomas's wise decision, congratulating themselves on the expansion of their enterprise. "Your education will be invaluable to us," Dr. Huger intoned, his eyes glittering with pride. "We are on the cusp of a new era, Thomas. With your help, we can refine our methods, expand our reach. Imagine what we could accomplish if only the world would let us." Thomas forced a smile, his mind racing. He listened as they discussed new breeding facilities in Texas and Arkansas, partnerships with medical colleges, and the latest advancements in psychological assessment. The language was always clinical, always detached. They spoke of people as resources, of children as investments, of women as vessels. The horror was in their certainty, their utter lack of doubt. All the while, Thomas gathered evidence. He memorized names, dates, and locations. He copied letters and diagrams, smuggling them out piece by piece, hidden in the lining of his coat or slipped to trusted allies in the abolitionist network. Every night, he added to his journal, the cipher growing more complex as the danger increased. He knew that one misstep, one careless word, one misplaced glance would mean ruin, not just for himself, but for everyone who had helped him. The contrast between the network's confidence and his own secret terror was almost unbearable. They saw themselves as visionaries, men of science and progress. He saw them as architects of a nightmare, their ambition built on the bones of the innocent. At night, he lay awake, replaying every conversation, every gesture, searching for signs that his mask had slipped. He dreamed of the breeding quarters, of women's silent eyes, of children's futures decided by men who would never know their names. Yet even as the pressure mounted, Thomas's resolve hardened. He saw the cracks in the network's armor, their arrogance, their reliance on secrecy, their belief that no one would dare oppose them. He realized that their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. If he could gather enough evidence, if he could expose their crimes to the world, their power would crumble. But the risk was total. The network had made it clear. Betrayal would mean not just death, but erasure. His family would be ruined, his name struck from the city's memory. The people he cared for, Margaret, the servants at Millbrook, the allies who had risked everything to help him, would suffer for his choices. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Still, he pressed on, Each day brought him closer to the moment of reckoning, the point at which he would have to choose between safety and truth. He rehearsed his plan over and over, searching for flaws, for any detail that might betray him. The final confrontation was coming, and he would have only one chance to bring the network down. Would you risk everything to expose the truth? Would you sacrifice your safety, your future, your very identity to bring justice to the voiceless? Tell us in the comments, because for Thomas Whitfield, the time for decisions was almost over. The double game could not last forever. And in the shadows of Charleston, the eyes of the network were always watching. The night of the meeting arrived with a sense of inevitability, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Henderson's Tavern, a fixture of Charleston's waterfront, was alive with the usual clamor of sailors and merchants below, but above, in a private room shrouded in velvet curtains and cigar smoke, a different kind of business was about to unfold. Thomas arrived precisely on time, his leather portfolio clutched tightly in his hand, his face a mask of calm determination. He had rehearsed every step, every word, but the weight of what he carried, the evidence, the risk, the hope pressed on him like a physical burden. Inside, the network's leaders had gathered in force. Drayton, Huger, Crawford, and 7 others sat around the polished table, their expressions a blend of anticipation and suspicion. The air was thick with the scent of brandy and the low hum of private conversation. Drayton rose to greet Thomas, his smile sharp as a blade. "Welcome, Mr. Whitfield. We're eager to see what you've brought us." Thomas nodded, his heart pounding. "Thank you, gentlemen. I believe what I have to share will be of great interest to you all." He placed the portfolio on the table and began his presentation, unrolling architectural drawings for converting Millbrook Estate into a model breeding facility. The men leaned in, murmuring approval at the efficiency, the attention to detail. Dr. Huger asked pointed questions about security and documentation, while Drayton praised Thomas's scientific rigor. For nearly an hour, Thomas played his part to perfection, feeding their pride, their hunger for innovation. But as the meeting reached its peak, Thomas's voice changed. He opened a second section of the portfolio, revealing not plans for expansion, but copies of the network's own master registry, correspondence, and financial records. The room fell silent as he began to read aloud names, dates, profits, the cold arithmetic of human breeding. The evidence was irrefutable, the details damning. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice steady, "what you see here is not just a record of your operations. It is a confession. Every name, every transaction, every child's fate documented, witnessed, and now exposed." For a moment, the men were frozen, disbelief and fury warring on their faces. Then Crawford lunged for his pistol, but Thomas was ready. He swung his weighted walking stick, knocking the weapon from Crawford's hand. The room erupted into chaos shouts, overturned chairs, the crash of glass as a window shattered. But Thomas was not alone. At that moment, the abolitionist network sprang into action. Marcus Henderson, the tavern's owner, had been waiting for the signal. He activated a series of prearranged alarms, hidden bells and coded knocks that summoned allies from the tavern below and the streets outside. Abolitionists and freedmen, positioned throughout the building, blocked the exits and secured the evidence. Some carried bundles of documents. Others stood guard, their faces grim with resolve. Drayton barked orders, demanding the destruction of the papers, but it was too late. Thomas's allies had already begun copying and distributing the evidence, ensuring that even if the originals were lost, the truth would survive. Dr. Huger tried to rally the network's members, but panic had set in. Some attempted to flee, only to find their paths blocked by determined men and women who had risked everything for this moment. Thomas fought his way toward the window, clutching the most damning documents to his chest. Behind him, the network's leaders struggled to regain control, their authority crumbling in the face of exposure. The room, once a sanctuary of power, had become a trap-a-cage from which there was no easy escape. He leapt through the shattered window, landing hard in the alley below. The night air was thick with the sounds of pursuit footsteps, shouts, the distant clang of a bell. But Thomas's escape was not a desperate flight. It was the final act of a carefully orchestrated plan. All eyes waited in the shadows, guiding him through a maze of back streets and hidden courtyards. At every turn, the abolitionist network shielded him, passing the evidence from hand to hand, ensuring that the network's secrets would reach the light of day. As Thomas reached the docks, a boat waited, its sails ready, its crew prepared. He handed off the last bundle of documents to Marcus Henderson, who nodded once, his eyes shining with fierce pride. "We'll see this through, Mr. Whitfield, no matter what it costs." But even as Thomas prepared to board, he sensed the danger was not over. From the darkness, Crawford and several armed men emerged, their faces twisted with rage and desperation. "You think you've won, Whitfield?" Crawford spat. "You think you can destroy us with a few scraps of paper? Our reach is longer than you know. You'll never be safe. None of you will." Thomas stood his ground, the weight of the night's events settling on his shoulders. He knew Crawford's threat was not empty. The network's power was vast, its influence woven into every corner of Charleston society. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. As the boat slipped away from the dock, the city receding into darkness, Thomas looked back at the flickering lights of Henderson's tavern. The evidence was out, the truth unleashed, but the cost had yet to be counted. The network would not fall quietly. Its roots ran deep, its shadows long. And somewhere, in the labyrinth of Charleston streets, the architects of the breeding conspiracy were already plotting their next move. The dawn that followed reach was unlike anything anyone imagined. Word spread like wildfire through the city's narrow streets and bustling markets. Something had happened at the docks, something that could not be silenced. By the time Thomas Whitfield arrived, clutching the battered ledger and a sheaf of copied documents, a crowd had already gathered dock workers, sailors, freedmen, and curious townsfolk, their faces drawn with anticipation and fear. Thomas climbed atop a stack of crates, his voice trembling at first, then growing stronger as he began to read. He read the names, hundreds of them, each one a life catalogued, measured, and sold. He read the details, the pairings, the profits, the cold calculations that had turned human beings into commodities. The words hung in the morning air, heavy as lead, impossible to ignore. At first, there was only silence. Then, a low murmur rippled through the crowd as the truth took hold. Some recognized the names ancestors, neighbors, friends. Others wept openly, the weight of generations of suffering suddenly laid bare. A woman in a faded shawl pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks as Thomas read the name of her grandmother, listed as Subject 22, High Fertility, Strong Constitution. A dock worker clenched his fists, his jaw set in anger as he heard the names of children marked for special training, their futures, stolen before they had even learned to speak. The network's leaders, once untouchable, now stood exposed. Drayton, Huger, Crawford men, whose power had seemed absolute, were nowhere to be seen. Their allies in the city's government and business community scrambled to distance themselves, their denials growing more desperate as the evidence mounted. The ledger, the letters, the diagrams. Each page was a nail in the coffin of Charleston's old order. But the reckoning was not just for the powerful. It swept through the city like a storm, forcing everyone to confront the truth. Families who had profited from the network's operations found themselves shunned, their names whispered in shame. Servants and laborers, long silenced by fear, began to speak, sharing stories of what they had seen, what they had endured. The city's churches filled with prayers for forgiveness, its streets with angry debates and hushed confessions. For Thomas, the moment was both triumph and torment. He saw the pain in the faces before him, the wounds reopened by the truth he had unleashed. He saw Margaret Pinckney, pale and trembling at the edge of the crowd, her eyes searching his for answers he could not give. He saw the children, wide-eyed and silent, clutching their mother's hands as the world they knew was torn apart. Yet even in the midst of chaos, there was hope. The evidence spread beyond Charleston, carried by abolitionists and journalists to Savannah, Richmond, Philadelphia. Newspapers printed the names, the stories, the horrors that had been hidden for so long. Federal investigators arrived, their questions sharp and relentless. The network's power, once so secure, crumbled under the weight of public outrage and legal scrutiny. The city itself was changed. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a new, uneasy awareness. Some clung to denial, insisting the documents were forgeries, the accusations lies. But too many had seen, too many had heard. The truth could not be buried again. As the sun rose higher, Thomas's voice finally faltered. He looked out over the crowd at the faces marked by grief, anger, and something else, resolve. The reckoning was not complete, but it had begun. The city would never be the same. He stepped down from the crates, the ledger still in his hands, and felt the weight of history settle on his shoulders. He had exposed the network, but the scars it had left would take generations to heal. The ripple effect would spread far beyond Charleston, reshaping families, communities, and the very soul of the South. In that moment, Thomas understood the true cost of truth. It was not just the destruction of the guilty, but the awakening of the innocent, the painful, necessary birth of a new world. The days that followed the reckoning of the old were marked by a strange, unsettled quiet, a city holding its breath, waiting for the dust to settle. Charleston's grand avenues, once alive with laughter and gossip, now echoed with whispers and suspicion. The old families, their names once spoken with reverence, found themselves shunned and isolated. Doors that had always been open were now closed, invitations rescinded, fortunes evaporating as quickly as trust. The Dradens, the Pinckneys, the Ravenels families whose wealth and influence had shaped Charleston for generations were now pariahs. Some tried to deny their involvement. Others fled to distant estates. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the stain too deep. Their homes, once symbols of power, became haunted monuments to a lost era. Their windows dark, their gardens overgrown. The city's social order, so carefully maintained, had collapsed in a matter of days. For the enslaved, the aftermath was a tangle of hope and uncertainty. Some were freed as the network's operations unraveled, their names finally spoken as people, not property. Others found themselves in limbo, caught between the collapse of the old system and the slow, uncertain rise of something new. Families that had been torn apart by the breeding program searched for one another, piecing together fragments of memory and rumor, hoping for reunion. The scars of separation and exploitation ran deep, and for many, freedom was shadowed by grief. Margaret Pinckney, once the darling of Charleston society, withdrew from the world. The truth of her family's involvement shattered her sense of self, leaving her adrift in a sea of guilt and betrayal. She wandered the empty halls of her childhood home, haunted by memories of laughter and light, now tainted by the knowledge of what had been done in the name of progress. She wrote letters she never sent, apologies that could never be enough, her spirit eroded by the weight of complicity. Thomas Whitfield, too, was changed. The victory he had fought for brought him little peace. He saw the faces of the women in the breeding quarters every time he closed his eyes, heard the cries of children whose futures had been stolen. He moved through the city as a ghost, his name both celebrated and cursed. Some called him a hero, others a traitor. He found no comfort in either. The cost of truth was written in sleepless nights and a heart heavy with sorrow. He tried to help where he could, reuniting families, testifying before investigators, offering what little solace he could to those whose lives had been shattered. But the wounds were too deep, the damage too vast. He realized, with a kind of horror, that exposing the truth was only the beginning. Healing would take years, perhaps generations. The echoes of the network's cruelty would linger long after the last ledger was burned. The survivors, enslaved and free, guilty and innocent, carried the burden of memory. Some found strength in solidarity, forming new communities from the ruins of the old. Others struggled to move forward, their lives marked by loss and trauma. The city itself seemed to mourn, its beauty now inseparable from the darkness that had always lain beneath. In the end, the cost of complicity was measured not just in ruined fortunes or broken reputations, but in the silent suffering of those who had been used, discarded, and forgotten. The horror was not only in what had been done, but in how easily it had been accepted, how the machinery of cruelty had been hidden behind manners, science, and the illusion of progress. Charleston would never be the same. Neither would Thomas, nor Margaret, nor any who had witnessed the truth. The ashes of the old order drifted through the city, settling in every corner, every heart. And in the echoes of their grief, a new story began to take shape, one built not on silence, but on the hard, necessary work of remembrance. It is often said, is written by the victors. But in Charleston, and across the American South, the victors were also the architects of silence. In the wake of the breeding network's exposure, investigators scoured plantation records, searching for more evidence. Yet, as quickly as the truth had come to light, it began to slip back into shadow. Ledgers vanished. Letters were burned. Witnesses disappeared or were silenced by threats and bribes. The machinery of secrecy, so carefully constructed over decades, did not collapse overnight. Rumors spread of similar networks in Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, places where the soil was rich and the law was far away. Some historians believe that the Charleston conspiracy was only the tip of a much larger iceberg, that countless other breeding programs operated in the darkness, their records destroyed before they could ever be found. The names of the enslaved, the details of their lives and suffering, were lost to fire, water, and the slow erasure of memory. Yet, secrets have a way of surviving. In recent years, researchers have uncovered fragments hidden in family Bibles, buried in estate inventories, whispered in the oral histories of descendants. A faded letter in a Virginia attic, a cryptic entry in a Mississippi diary, a child's name repeated in a grandmother's story. Each discovery is a thread, leading back to a tapestry of horror that was never fully unraveled. And the legacy of these secrets lingers. The scars of systematic breeding, of families torn apart and lives commodified, echo through generations. They shape the stories we tell about ourselves, the silences we inherit, the injustices that persist. The past is never truly past. It lives in the shadows of our institutions, in the gaps of our history books, in the uneasy questions we still struggle to answer. So I ask you, do you think all the secrets have been revealed? Or are there horrors still buried in America's past, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light? What stories remain hidden in the attics and archives, the memories passed down in whispers, the truths too painful to speak aloud? If you've made it this far, you are part of a rare community, one willing to confront the darkness, to question the official story, to remember what others would rather forget. Share your thoughts below. Have you heard stories in your own family, your own town, that hint at secrets still unspoken? What do you think it takes to break the cycle of silence? Because as long as we keep searching, as long as we keep asking, the past can never truly be buried. And perhaps, in the act of remembering, how do systems of evil hide in plain sight? Is it the comfort of tradition, the authority of respected names, or the slow, numbing effect of silence that allows cruelty to become ordinary? In Charleston, the machinery of suffering was masked by beauty, manners, and the language of progress. The most monstrous acts were committed not by monsters, but by neighbors, friends, and family people who convinced themselves that what they did was necessary, or even good. What would you have done standing in Thomas Whitfield's place? Would you have risked everything, your safety, your future, your family's name, to expose the truth? Or would you have looked away, telling yourself that it was not your place, not your fight? These are not just questions for the past. They echo in every age, wherever power is abused and silence is rewarded. We want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed injustice hidden behind respectability? Are there stories in your own family, your own community, that have been kept quiet for generations? Do you see echoes of Charleston's secrets in the world around you today, in institutions, in industries, in the ways we talk about progress and tradition? If you're brave enough, share your reflections below. Your voice matters. Every story told, every truth remembered, chips away at the walls of silence that protect systems of harm. This channel is more than a place for dark history. It's a community of people willing to look into the shadows, to ask hard questions, and to listen to one another. So, what do you think? How do we recognize the warning signs when evil wears a familiar face? How do we find the courage to speak, to act, to remember? Your thoughts, your stories, your questions, they are the beginning of change. Thank you for being part of this journey. The past is not just something we inherit, it's something we shape, together, by the choices we make and the truths we refuse to forget. Thank you for staying with us through this journey into the shadows of Charleston's past. If you've made it to the end, you're part of a rare group one, willing to confront the uncomfortable truths that history too often tries to hide. Your curiosity, your empathy, and your willingness to question the official story are what make this community so powerful. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see the world a little differently, please consider subscribing. Every subscriber helps us keep digging, keep questioning, and keep bringing these hidden histories to light. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode, because the stories we tell here are not the ones you'll find in textbooks. We want to hear your voice. Share your thoughts, your questions, or your own family stories in the comments below. If you know someone who needs to hear this story, send it their way. The more we talk about these dark chapters, the harder it becomes for them to be forgotten. And if you think this was disturbing, wait until you see what's coming next. In our next episode, we'll step inside the walls of a forgotten asylum, where the promise of scientific progress became a nightmare, and the line between treatment and torture vanished. It's a story of ambition, madness, and the thin veneer that separates civilization from chaos. You won't want to miss it. History's darkest secrets are never truly buried. They wait in the shadows, in the archives, in the stories we're afraid to tell. Will you be here when we unearth the next one? Subscribe, stay curious, and join us as we continue to shine a light on the places history hoped you'd never look. Until next time, remember, the past is never just the past. It's the foundation of everything we are and everything we might become. Stay brave, stay questioning, and we'll see you in the next story.